Hello watch enthusiasts. Now last year I produced a review of Jay's collection, and Jay is a viewer who has a very interesting vintage style dive watch collection, which has only grown over the past year, and he's asked me to produce another review of this collection, and I was very pleased to do so, because I do like looking over collections of my viewers after they've developed over the years. And so I would also say that if anyone else wants a collection review, I'm more than happy to produce them, though I regret over the past few months I've been a bit busy in terms of various other projects, but I hope to increase the number of these that I can do. However, before I begin the video, I would like to encourage you all to join the Watch Guys, which is, as you know, my group on Snups, which is a social media platform really for sharing pictures of your collections and your interests. And on the Watch Guys, which you can join by following a link down below for free, one can communicate with myself and indeed over 9,000 other watch enthusiasts over questions or indeed any inquiries you'd like to make, or simply to spend some time talking about wristwatches, which is after all what this hobby is about. So to be able to ask me or indeed any other enthusiasts questions, which I'll strive to reply to personally, then do follow the link down below to join the Watch Guys. And from the Watch Guys, we have this fantastic picture by Mike O'Connor of his visitor's caseback. And this is a hunter style of caseback, which opens up to reveal the wonderful rotor on the Miyota 9015 on this watch, along with the delightful hunter caseback which folds over, which really is something fantastic to see from a small brand producing something so interesting. Now the cornerstone of this collection is very much the Tudor Heritage Black Bay 7922, because Jay happens to own all three of the ETA models. Now, the ETA models were first created in 2012 with the red model, and the blue and the black versions came subsequently. And this was a piece which in many ways is one of the most important pieces of the 2010s, I suppose you could say, because this has been one of the watches which was crucial in terms of creating this trend and adoration for older vintage-styled watches, really down into the lower categories and brackets. And so as a result, the 7922 is a tremendous piece, really, which is a 41mm by 11mm watch, which fits very much within the sizing of a classically inspired piece, but with a slightly larger and bolder style in favour of a more modern aesthetic. And of course, Jay has all three of these models: the burgundy version, the first released with that wonderful burgundy bezel and the golden touches on the hands and the dial, as well as the black version, which features the same dial, which is beautifully domed as well, to provide a fantastic old-fashioned style with that grainy effect, which resembles a tropical style of dial, but without appearing too bold. And then, of course, there is the blue version with the silver hands and silver index marker rims, which produces a fantastic, far more military effect to this watch, as it was used in its blue form by the French Navy. And of course, this is the ETA version with its movement, which is basically an ETA 2824, which has been modified by Tudor themselves to be a little bit more resistant to shocks and magnetism. And this version is in many ways the most pure in terms of being true to the original, with that curved text on the dial, and the fact that it contains an ETA movement, which was always the case with old Tudors. And in many ways the genius of this piece is that we never expected something like this to come from the Hans Willdorf Foundation or the Rolex Tudor Group, for the simple reason that Rolex never go back to produce heritage-inspired models in terms of recreating the past. They tend to move forward. And so as a result, this move to create a watch which was wholly inspired by Tudor's past, and not simply by one model but by all of its diving pieces, with elements from different models, was a very alien concept and something which presented a whole new way of looking at the Hans Willdorf Group, and single-handedly really resurrected Tudor, which is something remarkable as well, making this watch in many ways one of the most important watches of the last 10 years. Now the next watch is another piece which follows along in that style of a vintage diver aesthetic, but playing along with it in a very different way. And this is the Breitling Super Ocean Heritage 42mm model. And this is the first generation piece, so the second generation piece I'll talk about in just a moment, because Jay also happens to have one of those. But the first generation piece actually predates the Tudor Black Bay quite significantly, and originally several versions were made, with a smaller version, as well as a 42mm version and a 46mm version, and only the two large models remain. And these pieces exhibit designs which are very much in keeping with Breitling's past in terms of their dive watches, with a style which appears rudimentary and far more dress-orientated than the style of the Black Bay, because there's no loom on the bezel of this watch, nor is there very much loom on anything other than the hour and the minute hand, not even on the second hand, with very small pips around the rest of the dial. which in many ways presents this 200-metre diver as something far, far more ornamental than indeed a professional dive watch. And I shan't bring up any direct pricing for this watch, because this, like those ETA Black Bays, are no longer made, and so as a result their prices vary on the used market. But certainly these watches were always more valuable than the Black Bays, due to their name and also due to the quality of care taken on, for example, the hands, because of course Breitling, unlike Tudor, is marketed as a flagship brand, and so as a result the greatest care was taken with the polishing and the detailing in a way which at the time Tudor perhaps couldn't compete with in terms of the politics of the watch world. And with this model we have a gold bezel insert, which is quite rare to see a gold bezel insert without the golden crown, but I think this was a very good call on Breitling's case, for the simple reason that a crown being used very regularly is going to wear down far more quickly than the bezel insert, and so as a result it's a nice way to add this lustrous air to a watch which was already never a professional dive watch. And of course the finishing is very much typical Breitling, with a fully polished 42mm case, and this is a piece which has been changed over the years. And despite the fact that it reached this stage where there were only the two models being produced, with most of these watches being produced in blue or indeed in black, without the gold bezel, the version which replaced it, that was released this year in 2017, is in many ways a very interesting success to this piece, retaining all the elegance of the original, but with some technical improvements and advantages. And the part of the Breitling Heritage Super Ocean range which has also been added to the collection this year is the new 2017 Breitling Super Ocean Heritage in black. And this is a watch which turned quite a few heads at Baselworld this year, and which I had the pleasure of taking a look at, albeit behind glass. And this is a piece which follows the lines very closely of the original, in terms of being a 42mm fully polished diver, with the same crown style and the same general styling. But the tweaks here I think have been extremely useful in terms of converting it from that far more dress-orientated model to a piece which actually is plausible as a dive watch. And that 42mm case is, as I've said, still there, with that wonderful style on the dial as well, with a matte black base, with these applied, curved and polished indices, which give a fantastic 1950s look to this watch, very much different from the 60s or 70s style of the Tudor Black Bay. And this watch retains the low levels of luminova on the rest of the dial, but has gained a lot of luminova in terms of the hands, which now have greater real estate in terms of the minute hand, and there is now a lume pip on the new ceramic bezel insert. And I feel the ceramic bezel insert really does transform this watch from something which was far more dress-orientated to something which, as I've said, really has converted into something far more professional, something far more sober. And I think the choice of having this version with the black dial and black bezel was really a good one, bearing in mind the fact that the gold bezel version fills a very different niche in a collection. The date window has also been moved to 6 o'clock, which only further balances the design, and this is all courtesy of the new calibre placed in this watch. And the calibre is in fact a Tudor-derived piece, and it's really derived from the Tudor MT5612 in the Tudor Pelagos, and indeed the date version of the Black Bay. And this is the Breitling B20, and features a 70-hour power reserve, 26 joules, and a fully decorated style, which is something you don't get on the Tudor. And this watch is made an especially good purchase by the fact that, taking into account the fact that it has a new movement and indeed better specifications than the last version, it is only about $200 more at $4,500 on the strap or $4,700 on the metal bracelet. And if one bears in mind the fact that prices always increase every year due to inflation, this increase in price appears pretty reasonable, frankly, bearing in mind the fact that you are getting a very different piece in terms of the specifications and the complexity of this timepiece. Now, the last two watches in the collection are versions of the new Omega Seamaster 300, and that's to say the 300 Heritage-inspired model, not the 300M being the classic blue version. And this is a 41mm watch with a case which is far more similar to the 57 and 1957 range of watches, which resemble their original cases before the lyre or twisted lugs were introduced. And as I said, this is a 41mm watch with polished tops of the lugs and a beautiful quality of brushing around the sides. Similarly, the crown is exposed on this model, and it doesn't feature a helium escape valve. And the design of this watch is immediately reminiscent of the 1957 model, with the simplified bezel taken down to simply 5-minute increments, along with a dial which is a matte black with a sandwich style of dial with a luminova plate placed beneath the black dial to shine through. Additionally, in terms of luminova, the watch is very well equipped, as the minute hand and the pip on the bezel glow a separate colour, a green, by comparison to the blue which the rest of the luminova glows. And this is interesting to see because it's a complete change in colour from that warm hue which you see during the day, which imitates tritium or radium on the original dials. This style is only emphasised by that white painted second hand, which only adds to the style. And in many ways one could regard this watch with its ceramic bezel insert and its very tight styling as a direct competitor to the Rolex Submariner, because this takes inspiration from a watch from that very era, from only 3 years after the Submariner, and is very much a flagship model, but not going into the realms of a professional dive watch in the most pure of senses, though this is completely usable for the vast majority of divers. And this all comes down to the movement used, which is the Omega 8400 caliber, which is a coaxial master chronometer caliber, which is anti-magnetic to 15,000 Gauss, courtesy of simply not being magnetic and not having to be shielded in any way, which is a very interesting way of making a watch anti-magnetic, and in many ways is far more elegant than simply putting it inside a soft iron core. And this is of course a coaxial movement, so it has that very low resistance and low wear George Daniels style of escapement, which only adds to the difference in this watch, as this does differentiate Omega as a brand trying to innovate in a way that Rolex simply isn't, and so this does place this watch as a direct competitor to the Submariner, with a very different style, and with an unmistakably Omega style to its design, from the hands to the dial, to the bezel, and even the profile of the timepiece. And as well as going with the styling of the collection, it's unmistakable that this watch is extremely good value, bearing in mind that the Rolex comes in at £1,050 more than this watch, at £5,450, so this watch is £4,400, which is quite remarkable really, bearing in mind the innovation and technology that's gone into this piece. And the final piece in the collection is this, the 2017 Omega Seamaster 300 60th Anniversary Edition. And this is the version which takes direct design inspiration from the 1957 release. And this piece features a design which has been almost unchanged from the original, unlike the modern 300, which retains a great deal of inspiration from the original, but doesn't remain quite as true to the original as this version does, down to the logo used on the dial. And this version loses a lot of the complexity of the modern version in favour of purity of design, where the dial is painted rather than being a sandwich style. Similarly, the hands, their steel rims are larger in keeping with the original. Additionally, the numerals on the dial appear less finished and far more traditional and original, whilst the text is almost identical to the original. Furthermore, the Swiss-made logo is a slight departure from the original, having a slightly different placement on the original dial, but nonetheless this retains a very, very close inspiration. Additionally, the bezel appears extremely fussy to the modern eye, with that internal polished ring, unlike the modern version, actually being a component of the bezel. And I've said quite a bit that I personally don't like the design of this watch, just because I feel it is too busy for my taste. Though one does have to remember that this style of watch is so unbelievably true to the original that, in that respect, I think this is an unbelievably well done watch, and an incredibly good idea for Omega to produce, with an execution which goes far beyond any remake we've seen apart from this timepiece, in terms of the attention to detail and the care to make the watch truly identical to the original, with the exception of that 8400 caliber movement underneath a closed caseback on this watch, which again is a bit different to the modern version with that exhibition caseback, but again is only further in keeping with the original and helps to make this watch a little bit slimmer than the re-edition, with a size which at 15mm thick with the re-edition was a bit of an inconvenience, so it's great to see them slimming the watch down with these measures. Now, bearing in mind the fact that Jay's collection is entirely made up of vintage-inspired dive watches, he's also after a watch which is a bit different, to provide a separate sort of piece which contrasts the other watches in the collection. And he's given me a few options which I'd like to talk through, because it's quite interesting to discuss these in relation to the consumer. And the first is the Rolex Datejust in 36mm. And of course the Datejust is a real classic in the way of a dress watch which is capable of surviving daily wear with real ease. And the modern Datejust in 36mm is about as close as you can get to the original, though the lugs have been widened, and the case has a more chunky sort of feel to it, as is the case with the maxi cases on Rolex sports watches. And so there are several versions available, and of course the range of Datejust running from the steel versions to the two-tones through what I like to call the 1.5 tones, which I'll talk about in a second, provides a great deal of scope in terms of what exactly you want. because at the bottom end of the range for £4,900, one can get the steel version on the Oyster bracelet, which has a polished steel bezel, as well as that classical brushed and polished Oyster bracelet, which fits this fully polished case very, very well. And of course, all Datejusts in the range of this size are fitted with the caliber 3135, which is a really classically correct movement, which Rolex has been using for a while now, and which provides all the complication and indeed the resistance that Rolex watches have come to symbolise. And so as a result, there's no real movement change between these watches in any way in terms of the finishing or indeed the performance. And I think the steel version offers a great deal of value because the next rung up, I suppose you could say, with the steel case, steel bracelet, but with a white gold fluted bezel, which is what I often call the 1.5 tone, just because it sits somewhere between the 2-tone and the simple steel version, because it doesn't have the 2-tone bracelet, is 5,850. So there's a significant jump in price for what isn't very much gold in terms of a difference. So you're paying £950 for a remarkably small amount of gold added to the watch in the same tone as steel. So I would say unless there is a real interest in having that fluted bezel, the steel offers a really tremendous amount of value for the price it's offered for. However, if one is interested in going for the 2-tone model altogether, then the resale values would suggest that going the whole way and having the 2-tone model with the centre link being in gold as well is the best way to go, because it does appear that the resale values of these are much better supported than the resale values of the version with simply the fluted bezel in white gold. And whether this is down to the material being more obviously gold, or simply down to a preference of design, I don't know, but this certainly seems to be the case. And of course the prices of these do step up, with the prices ranging from £7,600 to £7,700 on the tougher Oyster bracelet, or indeed £7,950 to £8,050 on the Jubilee. So it's worth considering which one will be better suited to the purpose, as of course the Oyster will be significantly more resistant, whilst the Jubilee will perhaps be more lustrous and attractive in an office setup. Now, remaining on the classically correct 36mm size, Jay has also suggested this, which is the blue dial version of the Rolex Oyster Perpetual in 36mm size. And this is a fully steel version with Rolex's proprietary 904L stainless steel, which is significantly more chemically resistant than normal steel, as well as having a supposedly slightly higher scratch resistance as well. But in terms of the appeal of this watch, I can certainly see this as potentially being a more versatile watch than even the Datejust. And this comes down to various aspects of this watch, but primarily the fact this watch provides the size, of course, of the original style of, for example, a 1016 Rolex Oyster Perpetual Explorer, with its smaller size. But also, this watch also features a design which is far more of a hybrid between a dress watch and a sports watch. Because whereas the Datejust is fully polished, this has sharper edges and a brushed and polished finish, which is much more in keeping with the sporting line of Rolexes. Similarly, the dial is very much styled to look like a Rolex Explorer dial, but with the Datejust style hands and the Rolex Coronet at 12 rather than the large loomed triangle. So you do still get significant luminescence, but you do also get that classically correct and very elegant vibe of this watch. Equally, the watch does come with the caliber 3130, which is the dateless version. Really, one can view it as the dateless version of the 3135 used in the Datejust. But it doesn't quite feature the same shock resistance as the version in the Explorer, which is the 3132, which is an extension of this movement itself. So in that respect, there is a bit of a drop backwards, but then it is significantly less expensive than an Explorer at £3,950, making this potentially a very interesting option as far as a slightly more versatile option to that Datejust goes, at a more reasonable price with that wonderful sunburst blue dial. Now, whilst these Rolexes would complement the collection in terms of providing a different side of that Oyster style presented in the Tudor Black Bay, one other option was the full-size 46.2mm version of the IWC Big Big Pilot. And this is, of course, a very large watch at just over 46mm, in fact, in brushed stainless steel, with that classical Flieger style, with no external bezel, except for a very thin, polished section, and that very large onion crown to be used with gloves. And I think this watch is a very interesting choice, and one which might be a good one, if you're indeed after a watch which complements the collection very clearly in terms of providing a vintage-inspired watch, but is a very different piece from the divers in your collection, and which provides a setup which is really very alien to a dive watch, with numerals rather than the typical style of indices, as well as a style of luminova and design, which again is very different and separate, down to that subdial with the power reserve and the date at 6 o'clock. Similarly, the sheer size of the piece is somewhat overwhelming for many, but fits even better with this idea of a fun watch that's separate from the others in the collection. And of course it's built to an extremely exacting specification, and has become a real icon with its tremendous matte black dial, those gorgeous indices which I think show a really wonderful play on that traditional Flieger style, and swing away from the very specifically historical Larcos, for example, or the Stovers, towards a design which is far more in keeping with IWC's approach to this watch as a vintage watch that's been made in a modern way. And the charm of this watch is only really augmented by the style of movement used, which is the caliber 5111 42 joule 168-hour power reserve in-house automatic caliber by IWC. And this, of course, demonstrates its 7-day power reserve on that side of the dial with that subdial, which I think is another nice touch. But being an automatic movement, I don't think it particularly needs 7 days of power reserve, but it's still a nice thing to have, with that date tucked away at 6 o'clock. And this is something quite interesting, because it does give this watch real charm in a way that's similar to the way Panerais have a certain charm, especially the in-house versions. However, where the Panerais in-house model pieces tend to start at around £6,000, or really £4,000 if you look on the used market, this watch is a staggering £11,450, which, in my eyes, despite the immense charm which is really inevitable with this watch, I do find this is a very, very large amount of money to put on a stainless steel watch of this type. Though that said, if it's a particular watch that you really are after, then little else will satisfy the interest in this piece, and of course for a long-term goal this is a wonderful piece to own, and does represent the pinnacle of IWC in terms of their sporting line, so certainly it's a very, very attractive piece and a very interesting piece, but I think it's worth considering other options before spending the £11,500 this watch costs. One alternative to the Big Pilot, which has been also recommended and suggested by Jay, is the Gould Master Ultra Thin Rose Gold. And this is a 38.5mm dress watch, which offers a wonderful level of execution, which at least in my eyes offers more in terms of retained value, and in terms of general aesthetic and mechanical complication than the IWC. And the design of this watch focuses towards being a really ultimate style of dress watch, with the small seconds at 6 o'clock on a beautifully textured subdial, with a sunken run around its edge, as well as these beautiful polished golden indices, with a slightly larger version of those at 12 o'clock. Additionally, the hands match the case, along with these very simple details on the dial, with these small pips on each minute around the dial. Equally, the size of the watch is very much dictated by the movement, which is the caliber 896/1, which is a 32 joule in-house JLC movement with the most gorgeous decoration. And this really is a thing of absolute beauty, with a wonderfully decorated rotor, as well as bridges and so on. And this is of course an in-house movement from JLC, which is just a hair under 4mm thick in terms of its thickness, which does seem relatively thick for an ultra-slim watch, but nonetheless the whole watch is brought down to 7.58mm, which is a very significant small thickness, and makes a really wonderful piece as far as dress watches go. And so I think this makes a fantastic option, because gold watches do tend to depreciate less than steel versions, and additionally a dress watch like this won't be used in as harsh conditions as the Big Pilot may well be. And so in terms of value investments, I feel this will perhaps make a better option. One piece that could potentially sit between these options in the collection is the Vacheron Constantin Overseas 2nd generation. And this was a version of the Overseas which grew to a larger size of 42mm, as opposed to the earlier smaller sizes, and additionally featured dials which were far more complex, with the 4 numerals at 12, 3, 6 and 9, as well as a more sporty style of aesthetic, with a further consideration taken towards combining curves with lines, as well as the fact that this has much sharper lines than the more modern version released this year in 2017. And featuring the caliber 11-20-26 from the brand, and bearing in mind the history and the importance of the brand with regards to the quality of their watches, these seem remarkably reasonable, bearing in mind the amount of care that's gone into them, costing between £7,000 and £8,000 these days in steel. And of course these can be found on a leather strap as well for even less than that, for around £6,500. Furthermore, the bracelets are extremely well made, very solid, and very much in keeping with the design of this watch. And due to that different dial, in many ways this differentiates itself far more significantly than the modern version from alternatives such as the AP Royal Oak and the Patek Philippe Nautilus. And I think this piece steps away from the norms in a way which is surprising, because it means that you get a watch which is true high horology in the clearest of senses, but doesn't cost the earth, and indeed is a piece which is far more understated than something from Patek Philippe's higher end sections, for example, or even the Patek Philippe Nautilus will be far more flashy than this piece, which is fairly subdued and subtle. The only concern with this piece, and something to consider if this is a serious contender, is the fact that due to the age of these watches produced between 2004 and 2016, they may well need to be in for a service, and of course this will cost a certain amount of money without that warranty, so that's worth considering. Now, the penultimate option is indeed the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Offshore 42mm in stainless steel, and this 42mm watch is regarded as one of the most interesting and important chronographs in terms of quality that's available in the luxury segment, especially in steel. And this comes with a 100-metre water-resistant case and is the smaller of the two chronographs in the offshore line. And in terms of design, this watch is very typical of Audemars Piguet, with that vertical orientation of the calibre 3126/3840. And this is a 59 jewel in-house movement with 365 parts, which really is regarded as one of the best chronograph movements, though it does run at a lower beat rate of 3 Hz rather than the 4 Hz of other chronographs. It is still a very impressive movement, and one which certainly has been proven enormously. And the watch comes in at £21,600, and it's an interesting piece, but I do feel that in terms of being an interesting piece in a collection, despite the fact that it's a very iconic watch, I personally feel that this wouldn't be a particularly interesting option by comparison to some of the other watches available, simply because for that price, really, you could get hold of a Rolex Daytona and have a great deal to spare. And as far as benchmarks, as far as automatic chronographs go, the Rolex Daytona is a heck of a piece to beat, and in many ways I feel the movement of that watch offers more than this timepiece. And so as a result, I can't really recommend this piece as the further expansion of this collection, but nonetheless is an attractive timepiece. Now the final piece to talk about is the Breguet 5817 Marine. And this rose gold watch in a 39mm size with 100-metre water resistance is really as close to a sports watch without going towards the Type 20 as Breguet will go. And this is a polished case piece with a very steampunk sort of style, with those sharp edges, visible screws, and a generally beautiful design and incredible execution, bearing in mind the fact that this brand isn't competing directly with the likes of Patek Philippe. And whereas the other options in terms of further purchases are very much pieces which roll along with the brand's general aesthetic, I feel that Breguet is the most adventurous, with semi-luminescent hands, as well as that wonderful golden rhodium dial with a fantastic patterning and that double date. And of course this on a rubber strap is a piece which can be worn both in the office and indeed whilst in the pool. Of course one has to remember it is rose gold, so will be quite fragile in terms of scratches. But in many ways this is a gorgeous piece for £14,450, with of course an in-house movement with a 65-hour power reserve courtesy of Breguet's wonderful engineering. And so I'll conclude this video here with this watch, which is a tremendous piece, and I feel a very interesting option, in many ways the most interesting and most different of these potential options in future. And of course whatever Jay chooses to go with in the end is very much his choice, but nonetheless I feel this is a wonderful option as far as a very different piece goes. And so I'll conclude this rather long video here, but I hope it was interesting in terms of looking into a few options towards this collection's evolution, and indeed to provide a certain glimpse into someone else's collecting, whereas of course I talk a great deal about my collecting. And of course it's worth remembering that I'm always happy to work with people to produce collection reviews, because it's always a pleasure to look into the choices of other people's in terms of interesting timepieces and their choices in terms of aesthetics, because it always brings more to my understanding of watch aesthetics and indeed the enjoyment of these high horology pieces. So I'll conclude the video here, but thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to be able to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.